Your liver is processing something right now, not tomorrow, not after your next meal, but in this exact moment. If you had breakfast this morning, your liver is breaking down the nutrients, filtering out toxins, and managing the metabolic load from whatever you ate. If you took medication, your liver is metabolizing those compounds. If you're exposed to environmental chemicals from cleaning products, air pollution, or personal care items, your liver is working to neutralize and eliminate them. And here's what matters. Your liver doesn't operate with the luxury of taking breaks or calling for help when it's overwhelmed. It processes everything that enters your body continuously without complaint until the cumulative damage from years of daily insults crosses a threshold and liver function begins to fail. The problem is that liver damage is silent. Unlike your heart, which announces dysfunction through chest pain, or your lungs, which signal problems through shortness of breath, your liver has no pain receptors in its tissue. It can be inflamed, fibrotic, and functionally compromised for years without producing any symptoms you can feel. By the time symptoms appear, fatigue that won't resolve, jaundice, fluid retention, confusion, the liver has often progressed to cirrhosis, which is irreversible scarring that destroys the organ's architecture and function. What most people don't realize is that the damage doesn't come from dramatic events like binge drinking or acute poisoning. It comes from small, repeated mistakes that seem harmless in isolation but create a toxic load the liver cannot fully clear day after day for decades. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the AANDE, I've seen what end-stage liver disease looks like. Patients in their 50s with cirrhosis who never thought they drank enough to damage their liver. Acute liver failure from medication combinations that seemed safe. Hepatic encephalopathy, which is brain dysfunction from toxins the liver can no longer filter, leaving patients confused and unable to recognize their own families. My goal now is to help people avoid these outcomes by understanding how daily choices, the ones that seem too small to matter, accumulate into liver dysfunction that could have been prevented. Before we go any further, I want to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most helpful videos I possibly can, grounded in science and the latest research to help you live longer and prevent the diseases I see in the emergency department every single day. And all I ask in return is that you give this fairly new channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you get to the end of this video and you didn't think it was worth your time or you've not learned something new, then feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings. But if you give me your time and your attention, I'll give you everything I've learned from over a decade in medicine. So please help me out. Hit the subscribe button to help this channel reach more people like you. And let's continue with the video. To understand how daily mistakes damage your liver, we need to understand what the liver actually does and why it's so vulnerable to cumulative insults. Your liver performs over 500 distinct functions in the body, but 3 are critical to understand for this discussion. The first function is detoxification. Every substance that enters your bloodstream, whether it's nutrients from food, medications, alcohol, or environmental chemicals, passes through the liver via the portal vein before it reaches the rest of your body. The liver contains specialized cells called hepatocytes that use enzyme systems to chemically transform these substances into forms that can be safely eliminated through bile or urine. This is called biotransformation, and it happens in 2 phases. Phase 1 detoxification uses cytochrome P450 enzymes to break down fat-soluble compounds. This process generates intermediate metabolites that are often more toxic than the original substance. Phase 2 detoxification then binds those toxic intermediates to molecules like glutathione, sulfate, or glucuronic acid to make them water-soluble so they can be excreted. The problem is that Phase 1 and Phase 2 need to stay balanced. If Phase 1 is working faster than Phase 2, toxic intermediates accumulate in liver tissue and cause oxidative damage. This imbalance is created by several of the daily mistakes we'll discuss, particularly medication overuse and inadequate nutrient intake to support Phase 2 pathways. The second critical function is metabolic regulation. Your liver controls blood glucose levels by storing excess glucose as glycogen and releasing it when blood sugar drops. It synthesizes cholesterol and lipoproteins that transport fats throughout the body. It produces bile acids that emulsify dietary fats so they can be absorbed in the intestines. And it processes amino acids from protein, converting excess nitrogen into urea that the kidneys can eliminate. When the liver becomes overloaded with metabolic tasks, Particularly from excessive refined carbohydrates and fructose, it begins storing fat within hepatocytes. This creates non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is now the most common liver condition in the developed world, affecting approximately 25% of adults. The third function is immune regulation. The liver contains specialized immune cells called Kupffer cells that filter bacteria and endotoxins from the gut before they reach systemic circulation. A healthy liver prevents gut bacteria from triggering widespread inflammation. But when the liver is chronically inflamed from fatty liver disease, alcohol, or toxin exposure, Kupffer cells become overactive and release inflammatory cytokines that damage hepatocytes and promote fibrosis. This creates a vicious cycle where inflammation begets more inflammation and the liver progressively loses its ability to perform all three of its critical functions. Now here's the insight that changes how we think about liver damage. The liver has remarkable regenerative capacity. It can regrow functional tissue after injury, but regeneration requires two conditions. First, the injurious stimulus must be removed. Second, the liver needs adequate nutritional support to fuel the regeneration process. When daily mistakes create chronic, unrelenting injury without sufficient recovery periods or nutritional resources, regeneration can't keep pace with damage. Healthy liver tissue is gradually replaced by scar tissue, which is fibrosis, and eventually by cirrhotic nodules that completely disrupt liver architecture. Once cirrhosis develops, the damage is permanent. The liver can still function if enough healthy tissue remains, but the scarring cannot be reversed. What becomes clear when you understand liver physiology is that liver disease is not a binary state of healthy or diseased. It's a spectrum of progressive dysfunction that moves through predictable stages: steatosis or fatty liver, steatohepatitis or inflamed fatty liver, fibrosis, and finally, cirrhosis. Most people spend years or decades in the early stages without knowing it because they have no symptoms. The daily mistakes we're about to discuss are what push people along that spectrum. They're the chronic insults that prevent the liver from clearing the previous day's damage before the next day's damage arrives. The first mistake that's damaging your liver is excessive fructose consumption, and I'm not talking about fruit. I'm talking about added fructose from table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and agave nectar that appear in processed foods, sweetened beverages, and supposedly healthy products like granola, yogurt, and energy bars. Fructose is metabolized almost entirely in the liver, unlike glucose, which is used by every cell in the body. When you consume fructose, it's absorbed in the intestines and transported directly to the liver via the portal vein. Inside hepatocytes, fructose is rapidly phosphorylated by an enzyme called fructokinase, which bypasses the rate-limiting steps that regulate glucose metabolism. This means fructose metabolism is essentially unregulated and proceeds as fast as fructose arrives. The liver converts fructose into acetyl-CoA, which is then used to synthesize fatty acids through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This is literally the creation of new fat from sugar. When fructose intake is moderate and occasional, the liver can handle this process without accumulating fat. But when fructose intake is chronic and high, which describes the typical Western diet, the liver produces more fat than it can export into the bloodstream. That fat accumulates as lipid droplets inside hepatocytes, creating hepatic steatosis or fatty liver. Research published in the Journal of Hepatology demonstrated that consuming just 25 grams of fructose per day, which is less than 1 can of soda, for 7 days significantly increased liver fat in healthy adults. The effect is dose-dependent and rapid. What makes this worse is that fructose metabolism generates reactive oxygen species and depletes ATP, which is the cell's energy currency, creating oxidative stress in hepatocytes. It also increases uric acid production, which promotes inflammation and insulin resistance in the liver. Over time, the combination of fat accumulation, oxidative stress, and inflammation transitions fatty liver into non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is the inflamed, progressive form of the disease that leads to fibrosis. The daily mistake here is not just consuming fructose, it's consuming it in quantities and frequencies that the liver was never designed to handle. A piece of fruit contains fructose, but it also contains fiber, which slows absorption, and antioxidants, which mitigate oxidative stress. A soda or a processed snack delivers concentrated fructose without any protective compounds, creating maximum metabolic burden on the liver. The second mistake is the chronic use of over-the-counter pain relievers. particularly acetaminophen, which is sold as paracetamol in the UK and Tylenol in the US. Acetaminophen is the leading cause of acute liver failure in the United States and the United Kingdom, accounting for nearly half of all cases. The reason is that acetaminophen is metabolized by the liver through the same phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification pathways we discussed earlier. At therapeutic doses, the liver can process acetaminophen safely, but even slight overdoses or cumulative use over days can overwhelm phase 2 detoxification, leaving toxic metabolites called NAPQI to accumulate in liver tissue. NAPQI binds to liver proteins and causes direct hepatitis death. The liver's primary defense against NAPQI is glutathione, which is a molecule produced from amino acids that neutralizes the toxin, but glutathione stores are finite and deplete rapidly when acetaminophen intake is high, or when other factors like alcohol consumption, poor nutrition, or fasting have already reduced glutathione availability. Research in hepatology showed that people who take the maximum recommended daily dose of acetaminophen, which is 4,000 milligrams or 4 grams, for several consecutive days can develop measurable liver enzyme elevations, indicating hepatocyte damage. This happens even in healthy individuals following package instructions. The daily mistake is twofold. First, people underestimate how much acetaminophen they're consuming because it's present in combination products like cold and flu medications, sleep aids, and prescription pain relievers. Someone might take a paracetamol tablet for a headache, a cold remedy that contains paracetamol, and a nighttime pain reliever with paracetamol, all in the same day, without realizing they've exceeded safe limits. Second, people use acetaminophen chronically for conditions like arthritis or back pain without understanding that the liver damage is cumulative. Each dose depletes glutathione. Each day of use reduces the liver's capacity to handle the next dose. And over months or years, this creates chronic low-grade liver injury that progresses to fibrosis in susceptible individuals. The alternative is not to suffer in pain, but to use acetaminophen strategically and sparingly, to read labels on all medications to avoid accidental doubling, and to support glutathione production through dietary sources of cysteine, glycine, and glutamine, which are the amino acids that make glutathione. Foods like eggs, chicken, garlic, and cruciferous vegetables provide these precursors. And critically, never combine acetaminophen with alcohol, as alcohol both depletes glutathione and induces the same cytochrome P450 enzymes that produce NAPQI, creating a perfect storm for liver toxicity. The third mistake is inadequate protein intake, particularly in people over 50 who are trying to control their weight or who've been told to limit animal products for health reasons. The liver requires a constant supply of amino acids to perform its detoxification and regenerative functions. Amino acids are the building blocks of the enzymes that run phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. They're the precursors for glutathione synthesis. They're necessary for producing albumin, which is the major protein in blood that maintains fluid balance and transports hormones and drugs. And they're required for liver regeneration after injury. When protein intake is chronically low, the liver cannot maintain adequate levels of these critical molecules, and detoxification capacity declines. Studies in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that older adults consuming less than 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, which is the minimum recommended intake, had significantly lower glutathione levels and impaired detoxification capacity compared to those consuming higher protein intakes. The liver was functionally compromised not because of disease, but because it lacked the raw materials to perform its normal functions. What makes this particularly problematic is that many people reduce protein intake at the same time they increase their exposure to toxins through medications, processed foods, or alcohol. They're asking the liver to do more work with fewer resources. The practical solution is to consume adequate high-quality protein daily, aiming for at least 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which for a 70-kilogram person is 70 to 84 grams of protein per day. This should come from complete protein sources like meat, fish, eggs, and dairy, or from combinations of plant proteins like legumes with grains that provide all essential amino acids. Spreading protein intake across meals is more effective than consuming it all at once because the liver can only use a certain amount of amino acids at a time, and excess is oxidized for energy rather than used for synthesis. The daily mistake is not just eating too little protein overall, It's eating it inconsistently and without understanding that the liver's detoxification capacity depends on it. The fourth mistake is chronic sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality. Sleep is when the liver performs critical maintenance and repair functions. During deep sleep, the liver increases autophagy, which is the process by which damaged cellular components are broken down and recycled. It enhances detoxification activity to clear metabolic waste that accumulated during waking hours. And it reduces inflammatory signaling, allowing hepatocytes to recover from the day's oxidative stress. When sleep is consistently inadequate, either in duration or quality, the liver doesn't get sufficient time to complete these restorative processes. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism showed that even a single night of sleep restriction increased markers of liver inflammation and impaired insulin sensitivity in the liver. Chronic sleep deprivation, defined as less than 6 hours per night for extended periods, is associated with increased risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, independent of other risk factors like obesity and diabetes. The mechanism is that poor sleep disrupts circadian rhythms, which govern the timing of metabolic processes in the liver. When circadian rhythms are misaligned, the liver doesn't know when to prioritize detoxification, when to synthesize proteins, or when to process stored fats. This creates metabolic chaos that manifests as fat accumulation and inflammation. Additionally, sleep deprivation increases cortisol and decreases insulin sensitivity, which promotes fat storage in the liver and impairs the liver's ability to regulate blood glucose. It also increases appetite and cravings for high-calorie, high-sugar foods, which further burden liver metabolism. The daily mistake is treating sleep as optional or as something that can be consistently shortened without consequences. The liver requires 7 to 8 hours of quality sleep per night to maintain optimal function. Anything less creates a recovery deficit that accumulates over time and contributes to progressive liver dysfunction. The fifth mistake is excessive alcohol consumption, but not in the way most people think. Most people understand that heavy drinking damages the liver, but they underestimate the cumulative impact of moderate drinking over decades. The liver can metabolize approximately 1 standard drink per hour. A standard drink is 14 grams of pure alcohol, which is 1 12-ounce beer, 1 5-ounce glass of wine, or 1 1.5-ounce shot of spirits. When alcohol is consumed faster than the liver can process it, acetaldehyde, which is the toxic metabolite of alcohol, accumulates in hepatiting and causes oxidative damage, inflammation, and interference with normal metabolic processes. Research in Hepatology International found that consuming more than 2 drinks per day for men and more than 1 drink per day for women, which are the thresholds for moderate drinking, significantly increases the risk of developing alcoholic liver disease over 10 to 20 years. The damage is not immediate, it's cumulative. Each episode of drinking creates a small amount of inflammation and fat accumulation. The liver can repair this damage if given adequate recovery time. But when drinking occurs daily or multiple times per week without sufficient alcohol-free days, the liver never fully recovers before the next insult arrives. What complicates this further is that alcohol depletes the same nutrients the liver needs for detoxification and repair. It depletes B vitamins, particularly thiamine and folate. It depletes glutathione, and it impairs protein synthesis. So chronic drinking doesn't just damage the liver directly through acosanyldaldehyde toxicity, it also prevents the liver from repairing that damage by depleting the nutrients required for regeneration. The daily mistake is not necessarily drinking too much in a single sitting, it's drinking too frequently without allowing the liver adequate recovery periods. The liver needs at least 2 to 3 consecutive alcohol-free days per week to clear accumulated fat, reduce inflammation, and restore metabolic balance. The sixth and final mistake is chronic exposure to environmental toxins without supporting the liver's detoxification capacity. We live in a chemical environment that humans did not evolve to handle. The average person is exposed to dozens of synthetic chemicals daily through food packaging, personal care products, household cleaners, pesticides on produce, air pollution, and contaminated water. These chemicals, including phthalates, parabens, bisphenol A, flame retardants, and volatile organic compounds, are all processed by the liver. Individually, exposures might be below regulatory limits, but cumulatively, they create a constant detoxification burden that the liver must manage on top of its normal metabolic functions. Studies in environmental health perspectives have documented that people with higher levels of environmental toxin exposure, measured through biomonitoring of blood and urine, have increased markers of liver inflammation and higher rates of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The mechanism is that many environmental toxins are endocrine disruptors that interfere with hormone signaling and metabolic regulation in the liver. They also generate oxidative stress and deplete glutathione during detoxification. When exposure is chronic and glutathione is not adequately replenished through diet, the liver accumulates oxidative damage that promotes inflammation and fibrosis. The daily mistake is not being aware of this exposure and not taking steps to minimize it. This doesn't mean living in fear of chemicals or adopting extreme avoidance behaviors. It means making informed choices about reducing high-impact exposures. Use glass or stainless steel food containers instead of plastic. Choose personal care products without phthalates and parabens. Ventilate your home when using cleaning products. Wash produce to remove pesticide residues. Filter drinking water to remove chlorine, heavy metals, and organic contaminants. And critically, support your liver's detoxification capacity by consuming foods rich in sulfur compounds like cruciferous vegetables, alliums like garlic and onions, and antioxidants like vitamin C and E. Now, let me be very clear about something. I'm not saying that occasional use of acetaminophen will cause liver failure, or that having a glass of wine with dinner will lead to cirrhosis. The liver is resilient and designed to handle episodic challenges. What damages the liver is the cumulative effect of multiple daily mistakes happening simultaneously over years and decades. It's the combination of high fructose intake, regular acetaminophen use, inadequate protein, poor sleep, frequent alcohol consumption, and environmental toxin exposure all occurring together without adequate nutritional support or recovery periods. Each mistake creates a small deficit in liver function. Together, they overwhelm the liver's capacity to maintain homeostasis. What I've observed in clinical practice is that patients who develop liver disease are often shocked because they didn't think they were doing anything extreme. They had a few drinks per week, used over-the-counter pain relievers as directed, ate a standard Western diet, and worked long hours with insufficient sleep. None of these behaviors seemed dangerous in isolation. But together, over 20 or 30 years, they created a liver that was chronically inflamed, progressively fibrotic, and unable to perform its detoxification and metabolic functions. By the time symptoms appeared, the damage was already advanced. The good news, and this is critical to understand, is that the liver responds rapidly to positive changes. Studies in clinical gastroenterology and hepatology have shown that reducing fructose intake for just 4 weeks significantly decreases liver fat and inflammation markers in people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Improving sleep quality for 2 months reduces liver enzyme elevations and improves insulin sensitivity. Eliminating alcohol for 3 months allows the liver to clear accumulated fat and begin reversing early fibrosis. The liver wants to heal, it's designed to regenerate, but it can only do so when the daily insults stop and when it's given the nutritional resources it needs to repair. The larger picture here is that liver health is not about genetics or luck. It's about the cumulative impact of daily decisions that either support or undermine the liver's ability to perform its functions. The 6 mistakes we've discussed, excessive fructose, chronic acetaminophen use, inadequate protein, poor sleep, frequent alcohol consumption, and environmental toxin exposure, are not rare or exotic behaviors. They're normalized parts of modern life. But normalization doesn't make them safe. It just means that liver disease has become normalized too. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease now affects 1 in 4 adults in developed countries. That's not a genetic epidemic, it's a behavioral epidemic driven by daily choices that seem harmless but create chronic injury the liver cannot fully repair. So where does this leave us? The question was what daily mistakes are hurting your liver, and the answer is that 6 common behaviors, individually minor but cumulatively devastating, are creating progressive liver dysfunction in millions of people who have no symptoms and no idea they're at risk. Excessive fructose from processed foods overwhelms the liver's metabolic capacity and drives fat accumulation. Chronic acetaminophen use depletes glutathione and causes cumulative hepatocyte damage. Inadequate protein starves the liver of the amino acids it needs for detoxification and repair. Poor sleep prevents the liver from completing essential maintenance functions. Frequent alcohol consumption creates ongoing inflammation and impairs nutrient status. And environmental toxin exposure adds a constant detoxification burden without adequate nutritional support. Reversing these mistakes doesn't require extreme interventions. It requires awareness of what the liver does, understanding of how daily choices impact liver function, and deliberate action to remove chronic insults while providing the nutrients and recovery time the liver needs to heal. Your liver is processing the consequences of today's choices right now. And the choices you make tomorrow will determine whether your liver continues down the path toward fibrosis or begins the process of recovery and regeneration. That process can start immediately, and the benefits are measurable within weeks. And finally, please subscribe to the channel if you found this useful to help me reach more people like you.